Turn now in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to continue our study of creation and this God who is, the God who's Alpha and Omega, the God from beginning to end. And so we're going to be in the second half of the 6 days of creation this week. Let me just encourage you to turn to Genesis chapter 1. We're actually going to kind of review the first portions of it to set the stage for the last 6 days of his creation work. But last week I began by asking a question and just starting off with the idea that sometimes, oftentimes, maybe most of the time, whether we intend to or not, we have a view of God that's too small. That the God that we know from the Bible is not necessarily the God that we live in light of every day of the week. And so like our fears, our worries, our doubts, our anger, our frustration, the despair we face when faced with, or the despair we feel when faced with overwhelming odds, the desire to control every circumstance, right? Like there's ways in which we reveal in the ways we act and think and practice life that though we can affirm the sovereignty of God, though it's easy to look at the screen and say, Alpha and Omega, God from beginning to end, yeah, I agree. There's a way in which in life we don't always apply that. We don't always live in accordance with it. And so I asked that question to challenge us to think and to see God as bigger than he is. But our problem isn't only that sometimes we have too small a view of God. The reality is sometimes we've just displaced him for a whole other God. The idea is that sometimes we just have turned to devote ourselves to give ourselves to something else altogether, even as we affirm the truth of the statement, Alpha and Omega, God from beginning to end. Yeah, I agree. And then we walk out into the world and we've devoted ourselves and we've committed ourselves to a God that really isn't a God at all. This is what Paul highlights in Romans chapter 1 when he deals with the reality that although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or count or worship him as God. They displaced the worship of God. They displaced the worship of God and the honor that only God deserves, and they gave it to the creature rather than the Creator. The reality is that we're still all struggling with that. Even the people sitting in this room, if we're to be honest with ourselves, we're still all struggling with that, wrestling with that. John Calvin is famously quoted as saying that our hearts are idol factories, that we're constantly creating for ourselves a God to worship rather than worshiping the God who actually created us. See, our issue isn't always that we have too small a view of God, but that we're worshiping some other God. Everyone worships. Everyone worships. We're all worshiping something. The question isn't, are you worshiping? The question is the God you're worshiping, the God you're devoting your life to, the God you're standing in awe of, the God that you're willing to sacrifice everything for, is that God worthy of that? Is he worthy? Is it worthy? Is she worthy of you? And all of that adoration, all that devotion, all that commitment. Throughout this series, we're fighting. We are fighting for a proper view of God. Not just a God who's big enough. Not just a God who is God from beginning to end. But a God who is not just great, but a God who's glorious. Who's worthy to be worshipped. Who's worthy to devote a life to. Who's worthy to sacrifice everything for, to throw everything else away and still know you're not losing anything. Is your God that God? That's the God the Bible reveals. That's the God the Bible tells us about. That's the God that we all affirm in our words. Is that God really the God of our life? That's what we're fighting for in this series. And ultimately, while there's many, many lessons we can draw out of Genesis chapter 1 and 2 as we look at the creation, I think ultimately that is the purpose for which God ensured they were written, recorded, so that we would know he alone is worthy. He alone is glorious compared to all other gods. We need to know him and pray that he'd meet us here today. Father, you have shown yourself